Crimea under a state of emergency. The move comes as Ukraine intensifies attacks on the Russian-controlled region. Kyiv says its aim is to press Moscow to end the war, but is that realistic? And why is Crimea so critical to the wider conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Now, more than 4 years into the current war, Ukraine is targeting the peninsula with increased drone attacks. In response, authorities in the Russian-controlled region have declared a state of emergency, admitting they're facing challenging times. This week, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy announced the start of what he called a 40-day influence operation to push Russia to end the war. But can Kyiv's broader strategy successfully end the conflict? And why is Crimea at the centre of this shift? We'll talk to our panel of guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Dmitry Medvedenko.
Ukraine's constant attacks on Russian-controlled Crimea have reached a new milestone. First, there were petrol shortages and power outages. Now authorities have declared a state of emergency across the region.
A state of emergency is being implemented to streamline financial issues as well as damage recovery. I ask everyone to remain calm and trust only verified sources of information. Together, we will get through this.
Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, and Ukraine has since said it would seek to retake the territory. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, one of the primary goals was capturing the south to connect it to Crimea. This logistics channel has been essential for Moscow to supply its war effort. It's also another reason why Ukraine is targeting Crimea. Despite its defenses, daily drone and rocket strikes have significantly damaged Crimea's power grid and oil depots. Residents say they're taking extra precautions these days.
I'm stocking up on water and food supplies. We stock up on everything as much as possible. For example, when the electricity is on, we charge power banks and phones. We try to save energy as much as possible.
Ukraine has been ramping up drone and missile strikes on Russia in recent months. Daily strikes on refineries have caused fuel disruptions in Moscow and other regions. And on the battlefield, Russia is making slow gains in eastern Ukraine. Its forces have taken more ground in Konstantinivka, one of the fortress belt cities in the Donetsk region. Taking full control of it would make the rest of the region much more vulnerable. Peace talks between Moscow and Kyiv have been effectively frozen since the Iran war began in late February. Both sides have called to resume those negotiations. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko held separate meetings with envoys from Ukraine and Russia's President Vladimir Putin this week. Lukashenko accused Kyiv of pressuring Minsk to stop supporting Moscow.
Representatives of Zelenskyy were here at this very place recently. I told them directly, guys, pass this on to your president. If he thinks that it's possible to talk to us like this and even try to drag us into a war, you must understand that the nature of the war would change instantly. It would be a completely different war. We received a reply. The president and his team understood this. So, we need to reach a substantive agreement.
Other countries in the region are upping their defenses. This is what the Estonian border with Russia looks like now. The Baltic states are regularly downing drones from both Russia and Ukraine. They're saying the fighting could spill over into NATO territory. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this now with our guests on today's Inside Story. We have Leonid Ragozin. He's an independent journalist who focuses on Russia, Ukraine and Eastern Europe. He's joining us today from Riga in Latvia. Yulia Kazdobina is a senior fellow in the Security Studies programme at the Ukrainian Prism Foreign Policy Council. She joins us from Krakow in Poland. And Stefan Wolff is Professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham. He's in Bolzano in Italy. Leonid, let me start with you. Crimea, if we go back to 2014, it was in many ways Putin's big prize. He took it really without a fight. Has it now become a liability?
It has become a liability from the point of view of the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian military command, and that's of course the game that is being played by the Ukrainians at the moment. In the hope that the situation in Crimea becomes so dire that the Russians will be coerced into accepting a kind of compromise that is more favorable to Ukraine. I'm not sure this is how the Russians are seeing it at the moment, and you can judge by the recent statements by Putin. He basically reiterated all the same conditions for peace that he's been saying for many months and even years concerning the Istanbul framework, plus all the land that Russia has occupied in the recent years. And plus to that, the withdrawal from the rest of Donbass.
Yulia, Crimea has been under pressure for some time. It is interesting, though, is it not, that Russia is now admitting how bad things have got and declaring a state of emergency. One assumes that's something they didn't really want to do.
Well, I think they're going to play the humanitarian card. They are going to try to blame Ukraine for causing a humanitarian disaster in Crimea and try to use it against Ukraine to put pressure on Ukraine. Crimea is very important for President Putin because this is probably the only one significant win for him in this war. And being able to hold on to it is very important for him. So he doesn't care about people in Crimea suffering, but he will use them. They already have created a huge traffic jam on the Crimea bridge and using civilians as a shield, as they very often do.
Stefan, let me ask you to take a step back and ask you about the importance of Crimea to both sides. Clearly, for the Ukrainian side, and for much of the international community, you just have to look at any map produced by the United Nations. This is Ukrainian territory and they want it back. For the Russians, I mean, it's strategic. It's the home of the Black Sea fleet. It's symbolic, as I say. It was in many ways Putin's crown jewel in 2014 that he got. And it's spiritual. It's key in Russian Orthodox Christianity, is it not?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a key part of Russia's narrative for the whole war. So I think from that perspective, it is very clear that Russia will significantly invest in keeping Crimea. I think the interesting thing for me is how the narrative around this latest sort of Ukrainian increase in attacks has actually evolved, where people have very much lost focus on the actual suffering that Ukrainians have endured for the past 4 years. I've just been in Kyiv earlier in the month, and it's very clear that Ukraine is a country and a society under huge strain from an ongoing and relentless Russian attack. So we need to be careful not to frame this now as an unjustified escalation on the part of the Ukrainians. I mean, this is a war that Russia started in 2022, arguably in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea already. And in a way, I mean, Russia is reaping the consequences of what it sowed.
Leonid, in terms of what Ukraine is doing to Crimea, it is a drone campaign. Do you think there's any way they could actually take back Crimea, or is that impossible just using drones?
Well, I think taking back Crimea is not part of the Ukrainian military discourse at the moment. Definitely not with the experts. But isolating Crimea and creating huge problems for the Russian military in Crimea, as well as France, making it a liability, as you said previously. That's what the Ukrainians have achieved, we could say, at the moment. And of course, there are ways for the Russians to adapt to the situation. And it should be said that what the Ukrainians are doing to Crimea and to the Russian occupied part of the Azov Sea region is what Russians did before to Ukraine, especially to the left bank Ukraine, to the eastern part of Ukraine. Ukraine has adapted to it in many ways. For Russia, there is a template right in front of their eyes how to adapt to it, and Russia showed its ability to adapt to very dire situations, especially during the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. That was a good example of adaptation.
Yulia, the Ukrainian defense minister quoted recently as saying it looks like Crimea will soon become an island. Is that the aim, effectively to make Crimea unlivable? And what then? What is the point of doing that, would you say?
Well, it's not making it unlivable, it's making it untenable for Russia to actually keep its troops there. And I would actually like to contradict something that Mr. Ragozin said, because he said that Ukraine is doing the same thing as Russia did. And it's not the same, because Russia ruins residential areas and it kills civilians, and Ukraine targets specifically military installations and those installations responsible for economic security of the Russian Federation. So to strip Russia of its ability to continue conducting the war. So Ukraine fights in a different way.
Yulia,
and I think
but you make that point, but clearly this drone campaign, cutting off fuel, cutting off supplies, is going to hurt the people who live in Crimea, and most of those they were Ukrainian citizens, and many of them still want to be part of Ukraine, as we understand it.
Yes, and we understand that, and for that specific reason, Mr. Brody, the commander of Ukrainian unmanned forces, he actually apologized to residents of Crimea, and all Ukrainian officials sent the message to residents of Crimea saying that please stay away from military installations and please forgive us for doing this, but this is the way we want to remove the occupiers from Crimea. And we remember the story of Kherson, how by cutting logistics routes for the Russian military, Ukraine was able to push Russian occupiers from the city of Kherson. And so I think the hope here is the same, that Russia will not be able to supply its troops in the peninsula, and it will not be able to protect it from the air, because Ukraine consistently destroys Russian air defenses. And so they will be faced with the choice of whether to leave or to start there.
Stefan, it's not just what's going on in Crimea. At the same time, and in recent weeks and months, we've seen constant hits on the Russian industrial and oil infrastructure, I think timed to go with the war in Iran and the Hormuz blockade, to make sure that Russia doesn't benefit economically from the higher oil price. But also, they've been taking the war to Moscow. One assumes that is to open people's eyes in Moscow and show them that perhaps what they're being told by state media isn't the entire truth.
I would absolutely agree with that. What it also reflects, I think, is quite a significant increase in Ukrainian capabilities, both in terms of the technology that they now have available, particularly for drones, but also their capacity to produce drones at a large scale and sustain what now for about 4 to 6 weeks has been a very significant, almost daily campaign where Ukraine has hit both critical infrastructure for the Russian war effort, but also in particular in and around Crimea has targeted military installations and military supply routes. And I think this, from a strategic perspective, I think is a very important move that the Ukrainians have been able to make here. But we should also understand that this is not necessarily a game changer that will now fundamentally alter what will remain, in my view, for many months to come, still a war of attrition between the two sides with no major breakthrough gains on either side.
Leonid, do you think that in Moscow they are somewhat surprised and shocked? I mean, obviously it's been developing over many months, but the scale now and sophistication of Ukraine's drones?
I'm corresponding, I'm talking to people in Moscow, and yes, there is a sense of shock at this new capability, in a sense. On the other hand, people were prepared to further escalation psychologically, and there was a sense, there is always a sense in Russia that Russia is not fighting just Ukraine, it is fighting the entire Western bloc. So people feel morally prepared to suffering, I guess, not on the same scale as Ukrainians have endured over many years now. But they understand that they are at war and the war has consequences. Whether this is going to affect the relationship between the government and the people, that's a big question. But from the way the Russians are reacting now, and from the history of Russia, which history of Moscow in particular, which saw events with more casualties, with more lethal casualties. You can remember the Dubrovka theater siege and other acts of terror that were staged in Moscow. People know that the war can bring things like that, and people are resilient, I guess. In the same way as Ukrainians. So there will be this competition in resilience, which Ukrainians entered 4 years ago, and the Russians are just entering now, but it can last for a very long time.
Yulia, President Zelenskyy has said this is a 40-day influence operation. Explain to me the overall aim of this stage of the war from the Ukrainian side.
Well, Ukraine has built up its capabilities and is pursuing the strategy of bringing the war to the Russian territory, making sure that the Russian population feels it and feels unhappy about the continuation of the war. And the goal is to get the Russian president to the negotiating table and to finally achieve a peace agreement, but without meeting these absolutely unrealistic and unreasonable demands that continue coming from the Russian president. So to show that Russia is not invincible as they claim, and that Russia is not as strong as it would like to seem, because it has spent so much time trying to capture so little of the Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine being much smaller than Russia, it still is able to fight Russia. So we do have cards contrary to what President Trump claims. And if we don't have them, then we make an effort to actually acquire them. And I think we've succeeded. And I think that Europeans have believed that it's possible to overcome Russia. So now it's trying to speak to Russia from a position of strength and to finally end this war and let Ukraine develop as a sovereign nation and just leave this war behind.
Stefan, we're focusing on the military situation. One part of this, which throughout the war I've found hard to gauge, is the economic situation in Russia. Would you say, what would you say Russia is suffering at the moment?
Well, that's hard to judge given how much the information space in Russia is actually locked down. I mean, what we can see from the reports that come out of Russia in terms of their economic performance, it still seems to be limping along, if you want, and has been doing so for the past 4.5 years now, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So, I mean, the Russian economy has not collapsed. I don't think it is necessarily close to collapse, but I think there will be significant shortages in Russia. I mean, one of the key problems that Russia is facing is the competition between manpower for the army and labor force for its defense industrial base. And that will be a very difficult conundrum for President Putin to resolve, not least because, as we have heard over the past couple of days, plans that he seems to have for a new wave of conscriptions will be very unpopular in Russia, and the Russian government's ability to actually fund those plans, as it did in the past, with huge sign-up payments, I think that is now under significant strain.
Leonid, it's interesting. It's 3 years ago this week that the boss of Wagner, Prigozhin, did his march towards Moscow. That was seen as one of the weakest points during this whole saga for Russia. And then soon afterwards, Russia looked very strong again. Right now, most of the Western reporting suggests Ukraine, for once, has the upper hand. Do you think there's a danger in these sort of snapshots in this long war and taking that view, particularly as in Donbass, in the so-called fortress belt, Russia seems to be saying it believes it's about to punch a hole in the Ukrainian defences?
Well, I think this make-believe, this PR search that a part of the of Western political establishment and media establishment is creating is ultimately dangerous for the Ukrainian cause, because the impression is being created that Russia can be defeated militarily, and that there could be a repeat of the Prigozhin situation in some way, in some shape or form, that parts of the elite could rebel against the Kremlin. I think this is all wishful thinking. In terms of the rigidity, in terms of the strength of the vertical of power in Russia, I don't think it has ever been stronger. It has ever been as strong as it is now. And this is because of the war, because it is essentially being felt by society as existential, and the equation works in the way that the more Ukrainian drones and Ukrainian missiles reach population centers in Russia, the more people get mobilized and rallied around the flag.
Yulia, I mean, Leonid there saying the military reality might not be quite what some in the West think. But of course, this is an information war as well as a military one. And the idea that Ukraine is doing well helps morale in Ukraine. But more importantly, in fact, it probably affects the global view, particularly among EU and NATO leaders, that Ukraine's not a lost cause. And most importantly, with one man, President Trump. And he seems to have changed his view. That's important, isn't it?
Yes, that is important, because it's important for Ukraine to keep President Trump involved in trying to achieve peace in Ukraine. We are actually not deceiving ourselves. We don't think that we can do it on our own, but at the same time, but we do need President Trump to actually moderate this and to also increase pressure on President Putin. And so it is important that he has changed his view. But when it comes to the way how is going to affect the Russian Federation, and that the Russian Federation is going to escalate. I think we need to look at the options that the Russian Federation has at this time, and whether or not it's capable of escalating. Because how can they escalate? I mean, they've already used all possible weapons they can against Ukraine. I mean, yes, they can steal Ukrainian innovations the way they've done before, but
Yulia, just to interrupt you there has been some suggestion by some Western intelligence services they might try and attack a Baltic country. I've also seen suggestions they might decide to carpet bomb the government area of Kyiv. I mean, these can't be discounted, can they?
Carpet bomb, you mean like from a plane? But Ukraine has air defenses. I mean, they could try to attack, as they've done, massive military attacks. So, okay, they will destroy Ukrainian government, but there are bunkers underneath, so Ukrainian government can continue. I mean, it's going to cause more destruction, but definitely not destroy Ukraine. Okay, Stefan, on Trump, I mean, in Evian, the G7 summit, I was there, and European diplomats were saying they felt it was what they described as the Evian moment. Trump has said he was hugely impressed and enthusiastic about what Ukraine was now achieving on the battlefield. How does Ukraine use that change in Trump's view now?
I think there are two important points to bear in mind here. The first one is that as President Trump has shown in the past, he can really not be relied upon to hold a view for a consistently long period of time. So today he might be all in awe of Ukraine. Tomorrow he meets with Russian envoys, and he might change his mind again, and he might double down on his earlier suggestions that he will force Ukraine to make concessions to Russia. So I think the key message here is to basically take whatever Trump offers, but not solely rely on the US as a counterpart here. On the other hand, and I think this was very clear at the G7 event, but also a number of the events around Europe before and after, that the Europeans have very clear aspirations to become strategically autonomous from the US, to be an independent player in this, and to lend their full support to Ukraine. But they suffer from huge internal coherence problems. Coordination is very poor. Some of the leading EU member states came out against the Council President, Antonio Costa, after he had tried to establish communication channels with the Kremlin. So,
Stefan
in
Wolff,
that sense,
Stefan Wolff, thank you very much, Leonid Ragozin and Yulia Kazdobina. If you missed any of our discussion, you can always see this and all of our recent programmes by going to our website, aljazeera.com. To get in touch with us, just visit our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or find us on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha right now. Don't go anywhere. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment.